So you may realize that we've done 2 response videos in a row, but that's mostly because we've discovered responding to other YouTubers happens to be what you guys like enjoying the most, or don't like. Either way, we like getting people passionate about certain things, and this was the next YouTuber a lot of people were asking me to respond to and talk to. Now, before getting into the response of this video, I want reminders for everyone out there who doesn't get the point of me responding to other YouTubers. It is not because I hate them, it is not because I despise them, it's not because I'm trying to be cynical, I'm just trying to have a conversation, which is enjoyable to me. I still have massive respect for this YouTuber. I don't want them to die. I don't want to hurt them. I'm not trying to be salty. We're just seeing success in this type of genre, so we're trying out something different and seeing how you guys will like it. If you like it, don't like it, please just let us know. But without further ado, this is a video by Front Page Tech titled The Truth About Apple and iPhone 10. Apple sucks now and it's your fault. Seeing that title, I was like, oh, this I have to be into. If it's my fault, this is being taken personally. So let's go forward with it.
Apple sucks now. And before all you Apple fanboys say, you don't know what you're talking about, you're just so biased towards Android.
That's me right there. See, you could just put my face there, but I might comment that exact thing. Nah, we're good.
I have been reporting on tech for years now, and for a very long time, I was a die-hard Apple fan. And yes, I switched to Android. I currently use Android, but I only switched because I felt like I had to because iOS was so sloppy.
I really don't want more people to keep using that as an excuse. One of the most common rebuttals I've seen in the YouTube comments, at least on my videos, is I hate Apple now, or Apple sucks, and by the way, I own these Apple products. That's not a counterpoint. I get that you're trying to say that, you know, I've tried Apple products myself, but realize that's a two-way street and it doesn't really work. Just because of the fact that I've bought and reviewed a Google Pixel doesn't make me any less biased against Google, and I don't try to hide that. I am very definitely biased against them, but buying and reviewing the product doesn't change that fact. Same with Samsung phones. I think they're good, but they're definitely not as good as my iPhone just because I bought and owned one. In fact, too, the Note 7 and the S8 doesn't change the fact that I'm biased against them. They don't run iOS. I like iOS. If you're biased against iOS, saying that you've owned an iPhone doesn't really change that.
So when I say Apple sucks now, I'm literally comparing today's version of Apple to Apple from years ago. I've always set them to a much higher standard than everybody else, and that's not my fault, that's because they set the standard. And now every year they become more and more disappointing. It's like that really, really great TV show that has always been good and we all love it, but now they're on season 9 and it's kind of rough and the writers are getting really, really lazy, but we're all afraid to admit that it's bad now.
If he's referring to The Office Season 9, then I agree. But in regards to Apple setting the standard, we as a culture kind of decide that. Most people buy Apple products. That's why most people consider Apple the standard. No, that is not just on you, but I kind of want to make sure we all realize Apple is not the ones deciding that they are the standard. If everyone started buying some other brand, then that would be the standard. We as a culture have decided that. But I think me and him probably agree on that.
None of the tech reviewers or tech experts tell you the truth anymore. They drool over anything new and fancy. Do you know why? Because you drool over it, and it gets them views.
I recently had a collaboration with Painfully Honest Tech, and we kind of brought up this point that tech reviewers, no matter your opinion on Apple, you can only win. Whether you hate Apple, you get views, you get clicks, or whether you love Apple, you get views, you get clicks. And first of all, I'd like to know what all these YouTubers are that drool over Apple products, because at least in the field of view of YouTubers I watch, most of them complain about Apple pretty often, and they usually have mean things to say, or Apple sucks now, wasn't as good as it used to be. That's a very common complaint, and I just thought it was interesting that he's kind of treating it like it's everyone on YouTube just loves Apple and no one's being honest about it anymore. I feel like most people are being honest in that most people criticize Apple. If anything, there's a very predetermined bias against Apple in at least the YouTube community. That's how I see it. Maybe each of us feel like we're rebels in our own world. I'm not sure.
For the last couple years, I've said that Apple is dramatically slacking off in quality control and attention to detail. The Apple I loved always created products with intention. Every minor detail of a device, every curve, every feature had a meaning, had a purpose. And you know what? I have always hated when people say if Steve Jobs was still alive, he wouldn't let this happen, because Steve chose Tim Cook and he trusted him to lead the way.
I also agree with this. Steve Jobs did trust Tim Cook, but I also would like to bring up that you really only notice bad things that are coming out from new Apple, whereas a lot of bad things Apple did in the past, they're not remembered for. Companies typically go out and are forgotten when they make mistakes, you know, like people not buying a product because it was crappy. Those are harder to remember, like the Apple gaming console or the Newton. Those are not things we hold at a super high standard, and therefore therefore they're not remembered. Whereas this is not that long ago, therefore it's very easy to remember that, and they're still selling both of these products. In regards to the Apple Pencil iPad Pro thing, it is weird, but I still prefer this to the quadruple A battery. Pixel Pen, yeah, that's... stop. And of course, the Apple Pencil includes a lightning adapter if you don't want to charge it that way, and Apple's not known for giving you lots of options, but they do give you the option to not do this. But if you continuously keep doing that option and then criticize it, then yeah, I guess that's annoying, isn't it?
Tim Cook and the rest of the people at Apple have made money and profits the highest priority, and quality and attention to detail of their products an afterthought.
I don't really think paying attention to quality and details has been ignored, but I also don't think there was ever a time in Apple in which profit was not a priority. Steve Jobs was not known for being the cheap guy, and Apple has a long-term history of selling products that were more expensive than the competition in favor of being the better product. But see, we like to criticize Apple for delaying releases, like AirPods were delayed, the HomePod was delayed. I think that's because they don't think it was quite ready for a release yet. I would argue that companies like Google do not pay attention to detail like that, because as someone who bought the Home Max when it first came out, that disconnects everything from the Wi-Fi and is not able to reliably turn on smart lights or play music. It's just bizarrely broken half the time, and the Google Assistant goes off randomly, or they send out Pixel 2s that do not have Android booted on them. Especially given the fact that there's significantly less Pixel phones sold than iPhones, I would say that's a much bigger deal. But because Apple sells one of the largest number of smartphones compared to other companies, when they make small mistakes in that lineup, they're noticed exponentially because a lot more people are buying them.
Let's talk about these latest iPhones. Can we be honest for a second? The iPhone 8 is really an iPhone 7S. And
That's a different name. I don't agree with Apple's naming scheme very often either. I wish they would have called it the iPad Air 3, or they would have called the 12-inch MacBook the MacBook Air. But is that saying the phone is bad? I would say that there have been lots of year-over-year upgrades that are way significantly less noticeable than the iPhone 7 to iPhone 8 upgrade. Changing to a glass back design, enabling 4K at 60, switching to Bluetooth 5.0, the fastest mobile CPU chip we've ever seen in any iPhone before, that Android phones that are about to come out still can't rival the speeds of that iPhone 8 starting at $700. I say that's a pretty significant change over from the iPhone 7. Should it have been 7S or 8? I don't care. Regardless, I think it's still a significant upgrade, especially when you look at past upgrades like iPhone 6 to 6S. Or back in Steve Jobs' time, as we like to always hold the Steve Jobs era as the better time for Apple. That was when we had iPhone 4 to 4S, in which you got the very first generation of Siri, which was such a noticeable upgrade. Physically, nothing changed, and in terms of camera, it was like, you can shoot at 1080p video instead of 720. Ooh, big difference. I would say that if this is considered an S upgrade, it's definitely one of the most substantial S upgrades we've ever seen. If you look back between 4 to 4S, 5 to 5S, 6 to 6S, design changes between 7 and 8 are far more noticeable than any of those past ones, in which it was like new colors. Should it have been named 7S though? Sure, why not? That doesn't change the fact that I do still think it's a worthy upgrade.
And I have seen way too many people say, they changed the back to glass. That's a design change. They've modified design a tad here and there between every single phone. It still doesn't excuse the fact that they slapped an 8 on this thing.
They did slap an 8 on this thing, but a pretty good S upgrade if it were one.
It is a mediocre upgrade at best. And you know what? It's intentionally mediocre because they want you to buy into the cooler upgrade, the cooler device. The iPhone 10. The iPhone 10 is a desperate move to catch up to competition.
Is it a desperate move if your phones are still outselling the competition? I wouldn't really classify that as desperate. With the percentage of iPhone users on the rise, and Apple making statistically more money every single quarter and topping their records, that's not how I would classify desperate. And if Apple does want you to buy something that's cooler, probably for good reason. They've been working countless months. I followed every leak, every rumor about this iPhone, and they're very, very proud of it. In fact, I can't think of a single iPhone upgrade that was more substantial than that of the iPhone 7 to the iPhone 10. You consider the fact that there was a year between those two releases, this is by far their biggest advancement between iPhones, and they're very proud of it. Of course they want you to take that option. They think that option's better.
They aren't the only compelling choice in the market anymore. They started slacking off, and they absolutely had to make a solid move and give us a phone that doesn't look and feel as dated as the rest. And you know what? They almost did it. But in typical new Apple fashion, they got lazy. First off, that notch. It does not have to be there.
Well, given for one, we tried to pass a patent in which they could embed the sensors underneath the display, meaning that they tried to erase the notch but couldn't figure out a way to do it. Second, there is an optimistic and cynical way of looking at the notch, as I've talked about many times on my channel. If you're angry at Apple, this is an intrusion. This is where the display should be, and the notch is cutting into that. If you're an optimist like me and try to see true potential in products, I look at it as an extension, as in the bezel could just go flat all the way across the top, but as we've seen certain apps try to adopt their own displays to erase the notch, doesn't really look that good. I, for one, am glad that Apple took an original approach. Sure, there's essential phones that have had notches before, but I'm saying if Apple would have not had the notch and just had a little bit thicker of a forehead, people would have accused it of looking more like a Samsung phone, and then they'd say Apple's out of ideas. Apple tries an original take and everyone says, ew, that's not what I want. There's really only two options I can think of. You can have a thicker forehead, or you can have a notch, meaning it's either copying someone else or you don't like it. So I'm not saying you're lying. I'm not saying that you're wrong to not like it. I'm just saying that the sales of this phone, which are through the roof for Apple, especially considering it's the most expensive iPhone they've ever sold, the notch is a minor quirk at best. Maybe someday they'll get rid of it, but statistically it is not affecting the sales of any smartphone, and that's why you're gonna see it on the Pixel 3.
Apple has some of the greatest engineers in the entire world. You cannot tell me that there was no possible way to avoid that stupid notch.
There was no possible way to avoid that stupid notch.
And I bet you any money that next year there won't be a notch and they'll call it a feature.
There will be a notch next year. If anything, it'll be a little bit smaller, but believe me, there are engineers around the clock trying to figure out a way to get those sensors underneath the display, but sometimes things can't get done. Sometimes you can't put Touch ID on an iPhone 4, even though they probably wanted to.
They don't have anyone there that's going to flat out tell them, no, we are not releasing this with this lazy notch on it. Figure it out. You know why? Because that's what Steve would have done. I can confidently, without a doubt, say that if Steve Jobs was still there, he would have laughed in their face and sent them back to the drawing board.
Just like Steve Jobs would have laughed at the idea of selling a $100 CD drive with the MacBook Air, because so many people use CDs with laptops back then. And how dare they charge an extra $99 for an external CD and DVD reader? Pfft, Apple would never do that. Oh, wait, what's this? Wait, this is... Oh yeah, this is something that came out in the Steve Jobs era. External CD. Yeah, this is just something Apple would not do today. No, it's called a compromise. It's not something that's new to Apple. Seeing that, most people aren't gonna mind the notch that much. They're gonna be like, oh, that's kind of weird, and then get over it. That's how they treated this situation. Of course, Steve is gone, so we're never gonna know truly how he would have responded. But my theory is he would have been like, if that's the best we can do, okay.
And if you in any way are defending them on this, stop it. Stop writing this stuff off as a design limitation.
No, sorry, I can't stop.
That's the problem. That's why so many of the things that they do are just an afterthought. Like here, scrolling through a web page, that notch covers the scroll bar. You think Apple did that on purpose? No, it's because they don't care enough to pay attention to these details.
Hold the phone the other way. Problem solved, like, you can see the bar. Okay, whatever.
I know, the notch is there because of all the amazing technology that goes into Face ID. But even that's not worth the notch. The very first demo they showed on stage for Face ID failed. Everyone's first look at Face ID ended up being, please type in your passcode. Yeah. Solid. And I know everyone wants to defend this and thinks it all makes sense. Apple themselves even came out and said it failed because it had detected too many faces before Craig's. You know, just like with Touch ID, how when you fail to scan your fingerprint so many times, it stops you in your tracks and says, okay, man, you know what? Just use your passcode instead. But that's not a good enough excuse. That's just answering one problem with another problem, is it?
That was a mistake, but it doesn't affect people's day-to-day use of Face ID. Yes, it was embarrassing. They could have planned that better, but why does no one give them credit that they also had a backup plan also logged in with Craig's face right next to it? They were able to move past it in like 10 seconds. I was more glad that they anticipated that mistake. If it did happen, they had a backup plan, opposed to having Craig have to enter it with the passcode. That would have been far more embarrassing, but they were semi-prepared. They could have been more good with plan A, but plan B worked out anyway.
Not to mention, it looks significantly slower than Touch ID. Oh, but then I get the solution, oh, well, you don't have to use Face ID. You can just use a passcode instead. Why? Why though? Why do I have to fall back and accept another solution because the flagship feature isn't fully fleshed out yet?
I'm often hearing the fact that Touch ID is faster than Face ID, but maybe this deserves its own video, but we always compare Face ID to when people start touching the Touch ID sensor. With Face ID, you really don't have to touch anything. What I love about my iPhone 10 is I have it propped up next to my iMac Pro here, and I can just tap on the display, and because it's pointed up at me, it immediately starts looking, and then I just swipe up. Sure, there's probably many instances in which Touch ID is faster, but Face ID starts looking immediately, where Touch ID has to wait for you to register your fingerprint. And again, I'll say this because I know not everyone watching is a subscriber. Touch ID never worked for me anyway because I have a skin disease known as psoriasis. It's actually fairly common, and there's lots of people I've seen in the comments that say Touch ID never worked for me ever. Whereas Face ID, I think, can apply in a lot more situations. It gives you more features like Animoji, as well as securing your passwords in an easier way, because if you need to log into something, Face ID just checks to make sure it's you really quick, opposed to you having to be like, oh yeah, read my fingerprint really quick, and then it goes through. Face ID works in a lot more situations. It is a lot more feature-filled than Touch ID, but we'll get more into Touch ID in just a second.
Why are you making excuses for them? They flat out removed Touch ID, the thing that was super fast, accurate, and reliable, and gave us essentially a feature that is still in beta and needs to be refined. Face ID being a little wonky would be entirely forgivable if I could just use Touch ID, go back to what I've been using for years, while in the meantime, they figure out the details of
Very, very common complaint for a lot of Apple criticisms is iPhone 8 is, oh, we've seen this before, not much is changing. I want an upgrade that's actually noticeable and different. Apple makes an upgrade that's notable and different. Oh, I don't like that you removed something that was reliable. Why didn't you keep it the way it was? Which do you want? If so, Apple made both. If you want a current modern day flagship that has Touch ID and it has it in an ergonomic place that's easy for you to reach and easy for you to use, buy the iPhone 8. They released a new phone with flagship features that can do that. If you wanted a giant change, if you want a significant upgrade that changes the way you use your iPhone, go with the 10. Apple provided both options. Why do we have to just keep jumping to the cons of both when I don't think people who would have an issue with Touch ID on the iPhone 10 would also hate the 8? If you like Touch ID and you thought it was reliable, they still made a phone that can do that. You could walk into the Apple store on launch day and get it right off the shelf without pre-ordering it. It was kind of nice, actually. I wish more iPhone releases were like that. And it's also cheaper than the 10, so if you prefer Touch ID, still there. Go for it.
But you know why Touch ID isn't in the iPhone 10? It's not because Apple is 100% confident in the future of Face ID. It's because they tried to put Touch ID in the phone under the display, but failed.
Minor criticism here. If you're talking about Touch ID being underneath the display, don't show a picture of it on the back, because those are two different things. But don't just say Apple failed, everyone failed. Samsung was also trying to put a fingerprint reader underneath the display and failed to do that with the Note 8. And they failed to do it with the S9, and we're likely not going to see that in the Note 9 either. Of course, who was the first company to do it? Vivo with the X20 Plus. And if Touch ID was on the back, everyone would just complain that Apple is copying everyone else, and that's not an ergonomic place. You could argue that Apple does like Touch ID, they just prefer it in the right place. And they don't think that putting it on the back would have been ergonomic or smart. That would have been a giving up option.
These amazing engineers being able to magically craft a fingerprint scanner under the display is something I would totally expect from Apple. And I would have been really, really impressed. But they just didn't do it. They settled for what they had.
No one could.
And that's not Apple. But you know what? They don't have to improve. They don't have to go back to their roots of focusing on the details and quality control, because people are going to keep buying every single subpar product that they put on the market. Apple doesn't have to change because nobody's asking them to.
Apple doesn't have to change because they're not doing very poorly. People are buying their products, enjoying them, and okay with paying a lot, and people are still overall fairly satisfied with them, including me. I'm not lying to you saying I like my iPhone 10. In fact, if anything, I'm risking my reputation by telling all of you that I like Apple because I know I'm getting hate for this. Most of YouTube does not agree with me. You don't want to go with Apple, you don't like the direction they're going. That's a fair assumption. And if you prefer other companies, then go for it. I'm cool with that. But don't act like everyone is just lying to themselves when they're enjoying it, because that's clearly not true. We all have personal tastes. I believe you prefer Samsung, and I think you can keep buying them and enjoy yourself. It's as simple as that. So thanks for sticking with me throughout the truth about the Apple and iPhone 10. I guess it's my fault because I keep buying into it, which if this is what Apple creates when I buy into them, I'm totally okay with it, and I hope they keep doing exactly what they're doing. I love where they're heading, and honestly, if Steve Jobs were still around, I don't think Apple would be very much different today. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I will see you in the next one.